The plan was simple: ruin the engagement. When Audrey saw the stranger in the dark suit, standing like a wolf at her own high society engagement party, she didn't care who he was. She grabbed his lapels and kissed him right in front of her controlling fiancé. It worked. The engagement shattered. But as the stranger's hand gripped the back of her neck, locking her in place, Audrey realized her fatal mistake. She hadn't just kissed a stranger. She'd kissed a monster, and he wasn't letting go. The ballroom smelled of expensive gin, dying orchids, and desperation. Audrey stood in the center of it all, wrapped in $100,000 worth of white silk that felt remarkably like a shroud. A string quartet played something classical and mournful in the corner, completely drowned out by the hollow laughter of the city's elite. To anyone else, it was the social event of the season. To Audrey, it was an auction, and she was the lot on the block. Preston's hand rested on the small of her back. It wasn't an affectionate touch. His fingers dug into her spine, a silent, constant pressure reminding her of exactly where she stood. "Smile, Audrey," Preston murmured, his breath warm and smelling faintly of mint and aged scotch against her ear. "The mayor is looking our way. Try not to look like you're being led to the guillotine." Audrey's jaw ached. She stretched her lips into a facsimile of a smile, nodding at a passing couple whose names she couldn't remember and didn't care to. "Better," Preston said. He adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo, a bespoke piece that cost more than most people made in a year. "After the wedding, we'll need to do something about your posture. You slouch when you're bored. It reflects poorly on me." There it was, the absolute, unvarnished truth of her existence. Her father had run their family shipping business into the ground through a lethal combination of bad investments and a gambling addiction. Preston's conglomerate had bought the debt. The marriage was merely the ink on the contract. Audrey was the collateral. She looked at Preston. He was handsome in a sterile, boardroom sort of way. Perfect teeth, perfectly parted blonde hair, skin that saw the inside of expensive spas rather than actual sunlight. He was also a sadistic, controlling sociopath who liked to break things just to prove he owned them. Last week, he had fired a maid because she looked him in the eye for too long. Next month, he would legally own Audrey. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest. The walls of the ballroom seemed to breathe, pushing inward. The crystal chandeliers overhead looked like suspended daggers waiting to drop. She couldn't do this. She had spent the last 6 months convincing herself she could endure it for her family's sake. But standing here, feeling the proprietary dig of his thumb into her vertebrae, the illusion shattered. She needed an out, not tomorrow, now. Audrey pulled away from his grip. Preston's eyes narrowed instantly, the polite veneer cracking to reveal the ugly machinery beneath. "Where are you going?" "To get a drink," she said, her voice entirely devoid of inflection. "Before I suffocate." "I'll get it." "No, I need to walk." She didn't wait for his permission. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a sharp rhythm against the marble floor. She felt his eyes boring into her shoulder blades, a promise of retribution later. Let him look. Audrey navigated the sea of silk and tuxedos, her eyes scanning the room. If she caused a scene, a real scene, Preston's pride wouldn't allow him to go through with the wedding. He required perfection. A public humiliation would sever the contract. Her father would be ruined, yes, but at this exact moment, survival instinct overrode filial duty. She needed a prop, a man to use as a grenade to blow up her own life. She bypassed the politicians with their practiced smiles. She skipped the aging heirs talking about their yachts. She needed someone whose mere presence would insult Preston. Then she saw him. He was standing near the heavy velvet curtains that led to the terrace, a shadow detached from the rest of the room. He didn't belong here. It wasn't just the suit, though his was charcoal, cut severely, utterly devoid of the peacocking flair the other men wore. It was the way he stood, utterly still, watchful, He held a rocks glass loosely in one hand, his dark eyes scanning the room with a profound, terrifying boredom. He had high, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with a shadow of stubble, and a small, faded scar cutting through the end of his left eyebrow. He looked like a man who was used to violence. He looked like a man who didn't give a damn about polite society. He looked perfect. Audrey altered her trajectory. The air seemed to grow thinner as she approached him. She could hear Preston's heavy footsteps behind her, cutting through the crowd. He was following her. He was angry. Good. She closed the distance to the dark-haired stranger. Up close, the aura of danger radiating off him was almost a physical weight. He noticed her approach, his dark eyes flicking down to take her in. There was no surprise in his expression, only a mild, predatory curiosity. 10 feet. 5 feet. Preston's voice barked out behind her, stripping away the polite volume of the puri. "Audrey, stop right there!" She didn't stop. She didn't think. Audrey stepped directly into the stranger's personal space. He smelled of rain, dark tobacco, and something uniquely masculine and metallic. He didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He simply looked down at her, waiting. She grabbed the lapels of his charcoal jacket. The fabric was heavy, expensive. She pulled herself up, pulled him down, and crashed her mouth against his. It was supposed to be a theatrical gesture. A quick, shocking collision of lips meant solely for the audience behind her. It wasn't. The moment her lips touched his, the world dropped out from under her. His mouth was firm, cool from the ice in his glass. For a fraction of a second, he was utterly rigid, a statue of stone reacting to a sudden impact. Audrey pressed harder, trying to make it look convincing, her hands clutching his lapels with desperate, white-knuckled force. Then the statue came alive. The rocks glass vanished from his hand, placed on a passing waiter's tray, or dropped, she didn't know. A heavy, calloused hand clamped onto the back of her neck. The grip was absolute. It wasn't the pinching, controlling pressure Preston used. It was the immovable force of a steel vice. He didn't just kiss her back. He took over. His mouth opened over hers, demanding and bruised, tasting of high-proof whiskey and raw power. He pulled her flush against his body. He felt like solid iron beneath the suit. Every muscle in his chest and stomach was tight, braced. The kiss deepened, shifting from a staged performance into something violent, hungry, and devastatingly real. Audrey's breath hitched. A hot, entirely unwanted shockwave of adrenaline shot through her veins. She was supposed to be using him, but she suddenly felt profoundly, terrifyingly used. She tried to pull back. His hand tightened on her nape. Just a fraction. A silent warning. You started this. The ballroom had gone dead silent. The string quartet had faltered to a screeching halt. The clinking of glasses ceased. "Get your hands off my fiancé." Preston's voice was a ragged shout, vibrating with a rage that bordered on hysteria. The stranger broke the kiss slowly. He didn't release Audrey. Instead, he kept his hand firmly on the back of her neck, turning her slightly so she was tucked into his side, shielded by his body. Audrey opened her eyes. The room was a tableau of shock. Guests were staring, mouths parted. Her father looked as though he was having a coronary event near the ice sculpture. And Preston was standing 5 feet away, his face purple, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. The stranger finally looked at Preston. His expression hadn't changed. He still looked bored. "Fiancé," the stranger said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, a voice used to giving orders in dark rooms. "Seems she has a strange way of showing loyalty." "I said," Preston spat, stepping forward. "Get your hands off her, you're a dead man." Preston reached into his jacket. A pathetic, dramatic gesture meant to imitate the bodyguards he paid to do his dirty work. Before Preston's hand could even emerge, the atmosphere in the room shifted. From the edges of the ballroom, from the doorways and the shadows near the terrace, men stepped forward. 5 of them. They moved with terrifying synchronicity, sliding between the wealthy guests without touching them, their hands resting casually inside their own jackets. The collective wealth and power of the room suddenly meant absolutely nothing in the face of organized, lethal force. Preston froze. His eyes darted to the men, then back to the man holding Audrey. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen grey. "You!" Preston stammered. The arrogance was gone. Fear, stark and naked, replaced it. Roman. The stranger, Roman, tilted his head. "Preston, I see you're still buying things you can't control." Audrey's heart slammed against her ribs. Roman. She knew the name. Everyone in the city who dealt in money, legal or otherwise, knew the name. Roman wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a socialite. He was the underbelly of the city made flesh. He controlled the ports, the unions, the invisible economy that ran parallel to the glass towers. He was a myth used to frighten corporate executives into paying their protection fees. She hadn't just kissed a random stranger to spite her fiancé. She had assaulted the head of the city's largest crime syndicate. She's mine," Preston managed, though his voice cracked. "Not anymore," Roman said simply. He didn't yell. He didn't strike a pose. He just stated a fact. He looked down at Audrey. His dark eyes were unreadable, but there was a dark, amused flicker in their depths. "Are we leaving?" he asked her. It wasn't really a question. His hand on her neck guided her forward. Audrey couldn't speak. Her throat felt packed with sand. She had wanted a grenade to blow up her cage. She had gotten a nuclear warhead. She nodded once, a jerky mechanical motion. Roman walked her right past Preston. Preston didn't move. He didn't breathe. The men in the tailored suits parted the sea of terrified guests, carving a path straight to the grand double doors of the ballroom. Nobody stopped them. Nobody said a word. The heavy silence was suffocating. Audrey kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, feeling the solid, immovable wall of Roman at her side. She had escaped the auction block. But as they walked out into the cool, damp air of the city night, a terrifying realization settled over her. You don't just use a man like Roman and walk away. The rain had started. It fell in heavy, freezing sheets, slicking the pavement and reflecting the harsh neon lights of the city. A black SUV idled at the curb, its engine a low, menacing purr. One of Roman's men opened the rear door. Roman guided her in first. The leather seats were cold. He slid in beside her, filling the space instantly, bringing the scent of the rain and that dark tobacco with him. The door slammed shut, sealing them inside. The heavy thud sounded exactly like a vault locking. "Drive," Roman said. The SUV pulled smoothly into the traffic, flanked immediately by two identical vehicles. A motorcade. Audrey sat stiffly, pressing herself against the door, trying to put as much distance between them as the confined space allowed. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the ballroom was rapidly wearing off, leaving behind a cold, shaking dread. She looked out the tinted window. The streetlights blurred through the rain. "You can drop me off at the next corner." Her voice sounded thin, pathetic. Roman didn't look at her. He reached toward the console, retrieving a silver case. He opened it, pulled out a cigarette, and lit it. The flare of the lighter illuminated his sharp features in brief, harsh orange light. He exhaled a stream of smoke, watching it hit the roof of the car. No, just a single syllable, flat, non-negotiable. Audrey turned her head to look at him. "I don't think you understand. I just needed to break the engagement. I used you. It's over now. You can let me go." Roman slowly turned his head. His dark eyes locked onto hers. There was no amusement in them now. They were cold, assessing, and utterly void of human empathy. "You think this is a game?" he said quietly. "You think you can drag me into your pathetic little high society drama, put your hands on me in front of my city, and then just ask to be dropped off at a street corner? I apologize if I insulted you," Audrey said, forcing herself to keep her chin up. She was trembling, but she refused to show it. "I'll wire you an apology fee, whatever you want." Roman laughed. It was a harsh, dry sound that had absolutely no humor in it. "A fee." He leaned closer. The smell of smoke and whiskey enveloped her. "Do you have any idea who I am, little bird?" "I know who you are," she whispered. "Then you know I don't need your money, and you know I don't let people use me and walk away." He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the bruised skin of her neck where Preston had gripped her, then trailing up to trace her jawline. His touch was feather-light, yet it made her heart hammer erratically against her ribs. "You made a claim tonight," Roman continued, his voice dropping an octave. "You walked up to me, in front of 100 witnesses, and you staked a claim. You took yourself away from that spineless suit, and you handed yourself to me." "I didn't hand myself to anyone," Audrey snapped, a flare of genuine anger piercing through the fear. "I'm not an object to be passed between men. You were an hour ago," Roman pointed out brutally. "You were standing there, letting him dig his fingers into you, ready to sign your life away to pay off your father's gambling debts. Don't play the independent feminist with me now. You were a transaction." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath because they were entirely, humiliatingly true. She stared at him, her chest heaving. "And what am I now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Another transaction?" Roman stared at her mouth for a long moment before his eyes flicked back up to hers. "No, you're a consequence." He leaned back in his seat, the momentary intimacy vanishing behind a wall of stone. "You wanted to escape, Preston. Congratulations. He will never come near you again. If he even breathes in your direction, I'll have his lungs removed." He said it so casually he could have been talking about the weather. But you don't get to go back to your old life. That life is gone. You blew it up. You belong to the blast radius now. Where are you taking me?" Audrey asked, her voice finally breaking. "Home. My apartment is—" "Not your apartment," Roman interrupted. "Mine." Audrey closed her eyes. The steady rhythm of the windshield wipers sounded like a metronome counting down the seconds of her freedom. She had orchestrated an escape, playing a desperate hand in a game she didn't fully understand. She had looked at a predator and thought she could use him as a shield. Now, sitting in the dark, moving deeper into the belly of the city he controlled, Audrey realized the brutal truth. The shield was a cage, and the predator wasn't going to let her out. The SUV descended into a private, subterranean parking garage, the steel gates rolling shut behind them with a final, echoing clang. Roman opened his door and stepped out into the concrete gloom. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He didn't have to. Audrey stepped out of the car. The cold air bit through her thin silk dress. She looked at the heavy concrete walls, the silent armed men standing by the elevators, and finally at the broad, unyielding back of the man who now owned her life. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and followed him into the dark. The morning light did not filter into the bedroom. It announced itself. It was a harsh, blinding white that bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows and struck the minimalist grey walls with the subtlety of a physical blow. Audrey woke with the taste of old adrenaline and dry cotton in her mouth. She was lying on a bed large enough to sleep six, tangled in charcoal-colored sheets that smelled faintly of cedar and the heavy metallic tang of the man who owned them. She was still wearing the white silk engagement dress. It was hopelessly wrinkled now, stained near the hem with something dark. Rainwater, street grime, or perhaps a smudge of soot from the underground garage. She sat up. Her spine ached. The events of the previous night crashed into her waking mind, not as a fluid memory, but as jagged snapshots. The suffocating ballroom, Preston's digging fingers, the stranger in the dark suit, the violent, earth-shattering collision of his mouth against hers. Roman, panic, cold and familiar, curled in her stomach. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress. Her bare feet hit polished concrete. The floor was heated. It was a detail so absurdly domestic it made her want to scream. Audrey stood and walked to the window. The city sprawled below her, a jagged spine of steel and glass piercing the low-hanging clouds. She was high up, 30, maybe 40 stories. The sounds of the morning commute were completely obliterated by thick, bulletproof glass. She was sealed in a terrarium in the sky. She found a heavy wooden door and opened it. It led to a hallway, which spilled out into a cavernous living area. The aesthetic was ruthlessly modern. Black leather, dark wood, exposed steel beams. There were no photographs, no art. Nothing to indicate a human being lived here, save for the faint scent of brewing coffee. Roman sat at a massive dining table that looked like it had been carved from a single slab of obsidian. He was wearing black slacks and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose forearms corded with muscle and laced with faded ink. A laptop was open in front of him. A steaming mug sat to his right. Beside it lay a disassembled matte black handgun, a cleaning cloth, and a small bottle of oil. He didn't look up as she walked into the room. "There's coffee in the kitchen," he said. His voice was a low rumble in the cavernous space. Audrey stopped 10 feet away. "I want my phone." "It's gone," Roman replied, dragging a small brush through the barrel of the slide. "Preston's people were tracking it. I had Leo throw it in the river on our way here. I need to call my father." Roman finally stopped his work. He set the brush down and looked at her. In the daylight, his eyes were the color of dark earth. They held a terrifying stillness. "Your father called me at 3 this morning," Roman said. Audrey's breath caught. A fragile, desperate hope fluttered in her chest. Despite his failures, despite treating her as collateral, her father was still her father. Surely he had realized the danger she was in. Surely he had threatened police, or lawyers, or whatever hollow threats he could muster. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Roman picked up the slide and inspected it against the morning light. He congratulated me on a new acquisition. And then he asked if the debt Preston held was now transferred to me, or if they were clear. The hope didn't just die. It shattered, sending sharp, agonizing shards into Audrey's lungs. She forgot how to breathe. The room tilted dangerously. Roman watched her carefully. He didn't offer sympathy. He merely observed the destruction of her reality. "He sold me," she stated. It wasn't a question. "He confirmed a transaction," Roman corrected smoothly. "Preston held a $50 million marker on your family's shipping line. When you put your hands on me last night, you publicly nullified that contract. Preston is humiliated. He looks weak. A weak man cannot collect a debt from a man who is protected by me. Your father understood the shift in power instantly. He is a parasite, Audrey, but he is a pragmatic one." Audrey stared at him. The white silk dress suddenly felt like a straitjacket. She crossed her arms over her chest, digging her nails into her own skin to ground herself. "So what?" she demanded, her voice rising, shaking with a volatile mix of grief and sudden blinding rage. "I'm just a trophy. A way for you to assert dominance over Preston? Preston is a cockroach in a bespoke suit," Roman said flatly. "I don't need a trophy to crush him. I just need a heavy boot. Then why am I here?" she yelled. Roman placed the reassembled slide back onto the frame of the gun. The metallic snick-clack echoed sharply in the quiet room. He loaded a magazine, slapped it into place, and laid the weapon flat on the table. He stood up. He moved with the terrifying, silent grace of an apex predator. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping only when his shoes touched her bare toes. Audrey refused to step back. She tilted her head up to meet his gaze. "You are here," Roman said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "because you ignited a fire in my city, and I do not let people play with matches in my house. You used my name. You used my face. You tied yourself to my reputation to save your own skin." He reached out. His knuckles brushed the side of her neck, right over her racing pulse. Audrey shuddered, but she held her ground. "You belong to my world now," he murmured, leaning down so his mouth hovered inches from her ear. "And in my world, we don't do catch and release." For 3 days, Audrey existed in a state of suspended animation. The penthouse was a fortress. The elevator required a biometric scan to operate. The heavy steel door at the back of the kitchen, presumably leading to a stairwell, was locked by a keypad she didn't know the code to. She was attended to by a man named Leo, a towering, silent giant with a scarred jawline who brought her meals, fresh clothes, and completely ignored her demands for a phone. Roman was a ghost. He left before dawn and returned long after dark. She would hear the heavy thud of the front door, the muted clink of glass from the living room, and then nothing. The solitude was maddening. It gave her entirely too much time to think. She thought about Preston's furious purple face. She thought about her father, calculating the monetary value of his daughter's kidnapping. And she thought about Roman's mouth, the taste of whiskey, the absolute, crushing weight of his presence. By the 4th evening, the silence broke her. She refused to sit in the bedroom waiting for the sun to set. She walked out into the living area. The lights were dimmed. Roman was sitting in a leather armchair near the window, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. He was still wearing his suit trousers and a dress shirt, though the tie was discarded on a side table. He looked exhausted, the lines around his mouth carved deep by whatever violence or politics he managed during the daylight hours. He didn't turn his head as she approached. "Leo says you haven't eaten dinner," Roman said. "I'm not a pet," Audrey snapped. "I don't need a feeding schedule." Roman took a slow sip of his drink. "Starving yourself won't change the locks, Audrey." She walked around the chair and stood directly between him and the window, blocking his view of the city. "I want to know the terms." Roman raised an eyebrow, the scarred one ticking upward. "The terms?" "Yes. The terms of my surrender." She crossed her arms, ignoring the way her pulse hammered in her throat. She was wearing a pair of black yoga pants and an oversized grey sweater Leo had provided. It wasn't armor, but it felt infinitely better than the engagement dress. "If I am a consequence, as you so eloquently put it, then I need to know the parameters. What am I supposed to do here? Sit in a glass box and wait for you to come home and look at me?" Roman stared at her. His eyes drifted down her frame, taking in the defiant set of her shoulders, the angry flush in her cheeks. He set his glass down on the side table with a dull thud. "Sit," he commanded. "I prefer to stand." "Sit down, Audrey, before I make you." The threat wasn't delivered with anger. It was delivered with the calm certainty of gravity. She weighed her options, realized defiance for defiance's sake was a waste of energy, and dropped onto the leather sofa adjacent to his chair. "You want terms," Roman said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The exhaustion seemed to bleed out of him, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "Fine. Here is your reality. Preston has put a bounty on your head." Audrey flinched. The word hung in the air, heavy and lethal. "A bounty? $3 million, Roman confirmed. "For you. Alive, preferably, so he can punish you for humiliating him. Dead, if necessary, just to spite me." A cold sweat broke out along Audrey's spine. She had known Preston was vindictive, but murder, contract killing. She had spent months attending charity galas with a man who was willing to put a price tag on her life over bruised pride. "He's a businessman," Audrey whispered, her voice cracking. "He doesn't know people who kill for a living." Roman finished for her. He let out a harsh breath. "Everyone knows people who kill for a living, little bird. They just dress them up in different suits." Preston contacted a mid-level crew operating out of the South Side. "They're sloppy, but they're hungry." "So you're keeping me here to protect me?" The concept felt entirely alien. Roman wasn't a protector. He was a predator. "I'm keeping you here because what is mine remains mine," Roman said. The possessiveness in his tone was stark, absolute. If Preston manages to touch you, he proves I am weak. He proves my territory can be breached. I do not tolerate weakness. Therefore, you stay alive. You stay untouched. You stay here. I am a pawn. You are the board. Roman corrected softly. The game is being played around you. You don't have to like it, Audrey, but you do have to survive it. And how do I do that? She asked bitterly. By reading magazines while you run the underworld? Roman looked at her for a long, silent minute. He seemed to be weighing something. Judging her, measuring the steel beneath her pale skin. Tomorrow night, he said finally, standing up. I have a meeting, a sit-down with the people Preston hired. I'm going to explain to them why taking his money is a fatal error. Audrey's stomach dropped. Why are you telling me this? Because you're coming with me, Roman said. He walked past her, his hand briefly, almost accidentally, grazing her shoulder. You want to know your place in this world. Tomorrow, I'll show you. Dress well. It's going to be bloody. The restaurant was in the basement of a meatpacking plant on the edge of the industrial district. There were no signs. The heavy steel door was guarded by two men who looked less like bouncers and more like paramilitary operatives. Audrey wore a black sheath dress Leo had procured that afternoon. It was simple, elegant, and cut low enough in the back to leave her shivering in the damp chill of the subterranean space. She walked beside Roman. He hadn't touched her since they left the penthouse, but his presence was a physical barrier between her and the rest of the world. The interior of the restaurant was a jarring contrast to the outside. Dark mahogany walls, low amber lighting, the smell of roasted garlic, and expensive cigars. The main dining room was entirely empty, chairs stacked upside down on the tables. Roman led her to a private room in the back. A heavy oak table dominated the space. 4 men sat on the far side. They were not wearing tailored suits. They wore leather jackets, heavy chains, and the kind of hard, flat expressions born from a lifetime of concrete and violence. The man in the center, older, graying at the temples, with a nose that had been broken multiple times, stood up as Roman entered. He didn't look at Roman. He looked directly at Audrey. His gaze was oily, calculating the $3 million she represented. Audrey felt a spike of pure terror, but she forced her spine rigid. She would not shake. She would not let Preston's hired guns see her sweat. Roman, the older man said. His voice was like grinding gravel. Carmine. Roman pulled out a chair for Audrey. He didn't say a word. He just waited for her to sit. She did, keeping her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide the trembling. Roman sat beside her. He didn't lean back. He placed his hands flat on the oak table. Let's make this quick, Carmine, Roman said. His voice was conversational, pleasant even, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. I understand Preston offered you a contract. Carmine smirked, leaning back in his chair. Word travels fast. Yeah, $3 million. It's a generous offer for a runaway bride. It's a trap, Roman said simply. Carmine frowned. A trap? Preston is an amateur, Roman explained, tracing the wood grain on the table with his index finger. He's throwing money at a problem because his pride is bruised. But he doesn't understand the ecosystem. If you take his money, you have to come through me to get her. He gestured lazily toward Audrey. And if you come through me, I will burn your Southside operation to ash. I will empty your bank accounts, I will seize your supply lines, and I will personally mount your head on the hood of my car. The room plunged into an absolute, suffocating silence. The air grew thick, electric. One of the men next to Carmine, younger, volatile, with a neck tattoo, scoffed loudly. You think you can just walk in here and threaten us? There are 4 of us. You brought a girl. Roman didn't even look at the younger man. He kept his eyes locked on Carmine. I didn't bring her as a shield, Tommy. I brought her as a witness. In a blur of motion too fast for Audrey's eyes to track, Roman moved. He didn't stand up. His right hand snapped out. grabbing the heavy crystal water pitcher from the center of the table. In a single, fluid arc, he smashed it directly into the younger man's face. The sound was horrifying. The crack of crystal meeting bone echoed like a gunshot in the small room. Tommy went down instantly, his chair tipping backward with a heavy crash. Blood sprayed across the mahogany table, dotting the white tablecloth in brilliant crimson drops. The two other men leaped to their feet, reaching beneath their jackets. Before they could clear leather, Roman drew the matte black handgun from his waistband and aimed it squarely at the space between Carmine's eyes. "Sit down," Roman commanded. His voice hadn't raised a single decibel. It was still entirely, terrifyingly calm. The two men froze. Carmine stared down the barrel of the gun, a bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead. Slowly, carefully, he raised a hand, signaling his men to stand down. They slowly lowered themselves back into their chairs. On the floor, Tommy was groaning, a wet, bubbling sound that made Audrey's stomach heave. The metallic smell of fresh blood instantly overpowered the scent of garlic and cigars. Audrey didn't scream. She didn't faint. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a continuous, painful vibration in her chest, but a strange, icy clarity washed over her. She looked at the blood on the table. She looked at the gun in Roman's hand. This was the reality. This was the man she had kissed to escape a bad marriage. "The contract is void," Roman said to Carmine, the gun unwavering. "You will call Preston. You will tell him the job is too hot. If I see your men north of the river, I will not use a water pitcher. Are we clear?" "We're clear," Carmine rasped, his eyes darting to the bleeding man on the floor. "Good." Roman stood up. He finally lowered the gun, tucking it smoothly back beneath his jacket. He looked down at Audrey. He expected her to be in shock. He expected tears or hysteria. Audrey stood up. She picked up a pristine white linen napkin from the table. She turned to Roman, and with hands that barely shook, reached up and wiped a single drop of Tommy's blood off Roman's cheekbone. Roman went entirely rigid. His dark eyes flared, catching the low amber light. He stared at her, genuinely surprised for the first time since she had met him. "Let's go," Audrey said, dropping the bloodied napkin onto the table. "I hate the smell of cigars." She didn't wait for him. She turned and walked out of the private room, her heels clicking sharply against the floorboards. Roman followed her a second later. When they reached the SUV idling in the alleyway, the heavy rain had started again. Roman grabbed her arm before she could open the door, spinning her around and pinning her back against the cold steel of the vehicle. His chest heaved. The cool, calculating mob boss was gone, replaced by something raw and wild. He bracketed her with his arms, his face inches from hers. "You didn't flinch," he breathed, his voice rough. "Would it have helped if I did?" she asked, her chin tilted up defiantly. Roman stared at her mouth. The streetlights caught the rain in his dark hair. The tension between them, previously born of fear and captivity, mutated violently into something else entirely. It was heavy, undeniable chemistry, fed by adrenaline and the sheer dark thrill of survival. "No," Roman murmured. His hand came up, wrapping around the back of her neck, just like he had in the ballroom. But this time, it wasn't a trap. It was a question. It wouldn't have helped at all. He leaned down, and Audrey didn't pull away. She reached up, burying her hands in his wet coat, and pulled him down into the dark. The kiss tasted of rain, cold metal, and a violent, desperate survival instinct. It wasn't like the kiss in the ballroom. That had been a performance, a frantic grasping at a lifeline. This was gravity. Audrey felt the solid, immovable weight of Roman against her, the heat of his skin searing through the damp layers of his suit and her dress. His mouth was punishing, a brutal exploration that demanded everything she had just tried to hide in that subterranean restaurant. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't coax. He took, and to her utter horror and profound relief, she gave it back. She wrapped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to the storm. Her fingers dug into the wet, thick hair at the nape of his neck. The world outside the alleyway, the corrupt city, the hitmen, her former life, ceased to exist. There was only the harsh rasp of his breathing, the brutal grip of his hands on her waist, lifting her slightly off the wet pavement, so she was completely reliant on his strength to stay standing. When he finally pulled away, the loss of contact was a physical shock. Roman rested his forehead against hers. His chest heaved. The cool, detached mob boss who had just shattered a man's face with a water pitcher was gone. In his place was something entirely feral. "Get in the car," he said. His voice was a jagged rasp. Audrey didn't argue. She slid into the back of the SUV, her knees suddenly weak. Roman climbed in after her, slamming the door. He didn't look at her as the motorcade pulled away, but his hand found hers in the dark. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip tight enough to bruise. He held her hand the entire way back to the penthouse. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a lockdown. The shift in the atmosphere happened the next morning. Audrey woke up alone in the massive bed, but the cold isolation of the previous days was gone. She walked out to the living area. The blinding city sun washed over the concrete floor. Roman was sitting at the obsidian table, but he wasn't cleaning a gun this time. He was surrounded by stacks of financial documents, legal briefs, and blueprints. Leo stood by the kitchen island, nursing a mug of black coffee, watching the monitors connected to the building's security feed. Roman looked up as she walked in. The feral energy from the alley was masked, packed away beneath the tailored slacks and the crisp white shirt, but the way his dark eyes tracked her carried a new, heavy weight. "Coffee is hot," he said. Audrey poured herself a cup and walked over to the table. She didn't sit on the sofa. She pulled up a chair directly across from him, right into his workspace. Roman watched her. He didn't cover the documents. "Sleep well?" "I slept," she said, taking a sip of the bitter brew. She looked down at the paperwork spread across the dark wood. She recognized the letterhead on one of the folders. It belonged to an offshore holding company. "You're bleeding Preston's shell corporations." Roman leaned back, resting his arms on the armrests. He looked mildly impressed. "You recognize the shell. I spent 6 months pretending to listen to him talk about his brilliance over expensive dinners," Audrey said, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Preston is arrogant. He thinks he's the smartest man in the room, which means he talks too much when he wants to show off. He routes his illicit capital through a subsidiary called Apex Logistics. It's a ghost company. They don't ship anything, but they hold the leases for the warehouses in the port district." Roman exchanged a brief, unreadable glance with Leo. "Apex Logistics," Roman murmured. He pulled a fresh tablet toward him and tapped the screen. "Carmine's crew operates out of the port district. Preston wasn't just hiring them. He was paying them with real estate. If you hit Apex," Audrey continued, leaning forward, the adrenaline of the realization sharpening her mind, "you don't just cut off Preston's slush fund. You evict his muscle. You cripple his ability to hire anyone else." Roman stared at her. It was a long, dissecting look. He was seeing past the white silk dress, past the collateral damage, right down to the cynical, survival-driven core of her. "You want to ruin him," Roman stated. "He put a price on my head," Audrey replied softly. "He tried to sell my life to a man with a neck tattoo in a basement. Yes, I want him ruined. I want him to have absolutely nothing." A slow, dark smile curved Roman's lips. It was the first genuine smile she had seen on his face, and it was entirely lethal. "Leo!" Roman called out without taking his eyes off Audrey. "Get the strike teams ready. We're going after the ports." Audrey sat back in her chair, holding her coffee mug with both hands. The fear that had paralyzed her for 3 days was gone. In its place was a cold, absolute resolve. She wasn't a hostage anymore. She was the architect of her own revenge, and she was using the devil himself to build it. The retaliation came 3 days later, And it didn't come in the form of street thugs. Preston was a coward, but he was a wealthy coward. He used the only weapon Roman couldn't just shoot: the law. Audrey was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a late lunch. She had fallen into a strange domestic rhythm in the penthouse. It was an illusion of normalcy, suspended high above a city at war. Roman had spent the last 72 hours systematically dismantling Preston's logistical empire based on Audrey's intel. Warehouses had mysteriously burned down. Bank accounts were frozen by anonymous tips to federal regulators. Preston's empire was bleeding out. The first sign that the illusion was breaking was the sudden dead silence of the penthouse's climate control system. The low hum of the air conditioning cut out. Then, the security monitors above the kitchen island flickered and went entirely black. Leo, who had been sitting on the leather sofa reading a newspaper, stood up instantly. He didn't say a word. He reached beneath his jacket and drew a suppressed handgun, moving towards the front doors with terrifying speed. "Audrey!" Leo barked, his voice tight. "Away from the windows! Now!" Audrey dropped the knife. She moved on instinct, ducking behind the heavy marble island. The front doors didn't open. They exploded. The heavy oak and steel blew inward with a concussive roar that shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows, raining a million shards of tempered glass across the concrete floor. Smoke poured into the living room, thick and acrid. Through the haze, men in tactical gear poured in. They weren't wearing police insignias. They wore unmarked black uniforms, moving with military precision. Preston's private army, bought and paid for with the last of his liquid assets. Gunfire erupted. The suppressed thwip-thwip of Leo's weapon was drowned out by the deafening roar of automatic rifles. Leather ripped, wood splintered. The beautiful, sterile penthouse was being shredded to pieces. Audrey covered her ears, pressing her face against the cold floor cabinets. Dust and drywall rained down on her hair. She couldn't breathe. The smoke was suffocating. Suddenly, a heavy hand grabbed the back of her sweater, hauling her upright. She screamed, thrashing, ready to fight blindly. "Stop." It was Roman. He was covered in white drywall dust, a cut bleeding freely above his left eye, but his grip was iron. He shoved a heavy Kevlar vest against her chest. "Put it on. Keep your head down." "Leo," she choked out, coughing on the smoke. "Leo is holding the choke point," Roman said. He didn't yell, though the noise around them was deafening. He slung a compact rifle over his shoulder and grabbed her hand. "We are leaving." He dragged her toward the back of the kitchen, toward the heavy steel door that had been locked since she arrived. He punched a 6-digit code into the keypad. The light flashed green, and the heavy door swung open, revealing a dark, narrow, concrete stairwell. "Down!" Roman ordered, pushing her through. "Do not stop until I tell you to." Audrey ran. Her lungs burned, her legs aching as they descended flight after flight of concrete stairs. The sound of gunfire grew muffled, replaced by the echoing slap of her own footsteps and Roman's heavy boots behind her. They emerged 30 floors down, into a subterranean utility corridor that smelled of rust and standing water. Roman bypassed the main garage, leading her through a maze of pipes and electrical panels until they reached a nondescript metal door. He pushed it open, revealing a dusty, rusted-out sedan that looked entirely out of place in the luxury building's infrastructure. He shoved her into the passenger seat, climbed in, and hot-wired the ignition in under 10 seconds. The engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. They burst out of a secondary service ramp onto a rainy side street, leaving the smoking ruin of the penthouse high above them. Roman drove with ruthless efficiency, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror constantly. He was bleeding, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Audrey sat beside him, shaking violently, the Kevlar vest heavy and suffocating against her chest. She had wanted Preston ruined. She hadn't fully comprehended that to ruin a man with that much power meant burning the city down around them. "They used a private tactical unit," Roman said, his voice deadly quiet. "Preston spent his last dimes on a kill squad." "Leo?" Audrey whispered. "Leo will get out. He knows the exfiltration routes." Roman replied, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his concern. He took a sharp corner, diving into the industrial district. Preston is desperate. He knows he's finished legally, so he's trying to cut the head off the snake before the feds raid his main office. Audrey closed her eyes, trying to force the panic down. The image of the tactical team pouring through the smoke burned in her mind. Preston wouldn't stop. He couldn't. If Roman lived, Preston was a dead man. It was a zero-sum game now. She opened her eyes and looked at Roman. The bleeding cut above his eye made him look like a demon. "Where is his main office?" Roman glanced at her. "Downtown. The glass tower on 5th. Why?" "Because," Audrey said, her voice finding a cold, hard anchor in the chaos. "He's desperate. He just threw everything he had at your penthouse, which means his tower is empty." Roman slowed the car slightly. He looked at her, truly looked at her, reading the sharp, dangerous calculation in her eyes. "In the sub-basement of his corporate tower, Preston keeps a physical ledger," Audrey explained rapidly. "He doesn't trust digital files for his worst crimes, blackmail, bribes to city officials, the judges on his payroll. It's all on paper, a red leather-bound book in a biometric safe. You know where this is. He took me down there once," she said, disgust lacing her tone, "to show me how untouchable he was, to show me that he owned the police, the politicians, the judges. He wanted me to know that running was useless." Roman pulled the car into a dark, abandoned parking garage. He killed the engine. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of rain hammering against the concrete above. "If we get that book," Roman said slowly, "Preston doesn't just lose his money. He loses his protection. The entire city infrastructure will turn on him to save themselves." "Yes," Audrey said. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "But we have to go now, before he realizes the strike team failed, before he goes to the tower to clear out the safe and flee the country." Roman reached across the console. He gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheekbone. His touch was jarringly tender against the backdrop of violence. "Audrey," he said quietly, "if we walk into that tower, there is no going back to the light. You will cross a line you can never uncross. You will be an accessory to the fall of an empire." She didn't flinch. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes for a brief second to absorb his heat, his strength. When she opened them, they were as dark and unyielding as his. "The light was a glass cage, Roman," she whispered. "Burn it down." The glass tower on 5th Avenue was a monument to Preston's ego. It was sleek, modern, and entirely devoid of soul. At 2:00 a.m., the lobby was silent, save for a single security guard stationed at the polished marble desk. He was dead asleep, snoring softly into a half-eaten sandwich. Roman bypassed him completely. He led Audrey through the service entrance, picking the high-security lock on the maintenance door in under 30 seconds. They moved like shadows. Roman held the suppressed rifle, taking the lead, sweeping the corridors with cold, lethal precision. Audrey followed closely, her heart hammering a steady, relentless beat against her ribs. The Kevlar vest under her coat felt like armor. She belonged in this dark space. They reached the private elevator bay reserved for the executive suite. Audrey punched in the sequence Preston had arrogantly flaunted months ago. 418. His own birthday. The man's vanity was his ultimate flaw. The elevator didn't go up. It descended, sinking deep into the bedrock of the city. The sub-basement was cold. It smelled of ozone and heavily filtered air. As the doors slid open, Roman stepped out first, weapon raised. "Clear," he murmured. Audrey stepped out. The hallway was lined with heavy steel doors, server rooms housing the legitimate facade of Preston's empire. At the very end of the hall stood a single, unmarked, reinforced door. "There," Audrey pointed. They walked toward it. The silence was absolute, heavy with the weight of impending destruction. As they'd reached the door, Roman examined the biometric scanner. It requires a retinal scan, Roman said, his voice tight. I can blow the hinges, but it will trigger a silent alarm. The police response time here is less than 3 minutes. Audrey stepped up to the panel. He didn't just use his retina. He liked redundancies. He set up a voice override in case he was ever incapacitated. Do you know the phrase? I know the man, Audrey said. She leaned close to the microphone grid on the panel. She closed her eyes, channeling the cold, arrogant sneer Preston used when he looked down on the rest of the world. She pitched her voice to mimic the cadence of the automated system she had heard him use. Vincit qui se vincit, Audrey said clearly. He conquers who conquers himself. The machine whirred. A green light flashed. The heavy steel bolts inside the door clanked back with a resounding thud. Roman looked at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound, terrifying admiration. Remind me never to give you my passwords. You wouldn't have to. I'd just guess them, she replied, pushing the door open. The room was small, dominated by a massive, floor-standing safe. Roman didn't hesitate. He pulled a small brick of C4 from his tactical vest, molded it to the electronic lock mechanism, and inserted a detonator. Back, he ordered, grabbing her waist and pulling her behind the thick steel frame of the open door. The explosion was muffled, a sharp, concussive pop that smelled of sulfur and burned plastic. Roman kicked the heavy safe door. It groaned, the melted locking mechanism giving way, and swung open. Inside, sitting on a velvet shelf, was a thick, red, leather-bound ledger. Audrey reached in and pulled it out. It was heavy. It contained the ruined lives, the blackmail, the rot that held Preston's world together. She flipped it open. Names of judges, police commissioners, city councilmen, all meticulously logged next to wire transfer amounts and offshore account numbers. We have it, she breathed. Then let's go, Roman said. Before they could turn back to the door, the elevator at the end of the hall chimed. Roman shoved Audrey entirely behind him, raising his rifle. The doors slid open. Preston stepped out. He looked horrendous. His bespoke suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His perfect hair was disheveled. He held a silver revolver in his hand, his grip shaking violently. Behind him stood 2 massive men in tactical gear, survivors of the penthouse raid. Preston's eyes locked onto Roman, then shifted to Audrey, holding the red ledger. His face twisted into a mask of absolute, unhinged hatred. You! Preston spat, his voice echoing in the concrete corridor. You ungrateful, pathetic little... Careful, Preston, Roman said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The rifle was aimed squarely at Preston's chest. You're already a dead man. Don't make it messy. I have 2 men behind me. Preston laughed, though it sounded like a sob. You have a gun. You shoot me, they shoot you. It's a draw, Roman. I don't need to shoot you, Roman said calmly. Audrey just killed you. Preston looked at Audrey. He raised the revolver, pointing it directly at her face. Put the book back, Audrey. Put it back, and I'll make your death quick. Your father is already ruined. You have nowhere to go. Audrey didn't hide behind Roman's broad shoulders. She stepped to the side, exposing herself to Preston's gun. Roman tensed, letting out a low growl of warning, but she held her ground. She looked at Preston. She looked at the man who had bought her, who had treated her like cattle, who had tried to have her murdered. She felt no fear, only a profound, freezing pity. You never understood power, Preston, Audrey said, her voice echoing off the cold walls. It was steady, calm, and utterly ruthless. You thought power was owning people. You thought it was buying them. But power isn't a transaction. She lifted the heavy red ledger in her hands. Power, Audrey continued, is knowing exactly where to strike. She didn't drop the book. She didn't hand it to Roman. She gripped it with both hands and, with all her strength, hurled it directly at the fire alarm pull station on the wall beside the safe. The heavy spine hit the red plastic housing, shattering it instantly. The building erupted. Klaxons blared, a deafening, rhythmic scream that tore through the basement. Overhead, the fire suppression system activated. It wasn't water. It was a chemical foam designed to protect electronics, spraying down in a thick, blinding white cloud. The sudden noise and the blinding foam shattered Preston's fragile nerves. He fired blindly. The gunshot was deafening, the bullet sparking against the concrete ceiling. Roman moved in the chaos. He didn't shoot Preston. He shot the two tactical guards, double taps to send a mass through the foam. They dropped instantly. Roman closed the distance to Preston in two massive strides. He slapped the revolver out of Preston's hand, the weapon clattering away into the foam. Roman grabbed Preston by the throat and slammed him against the steel wall. Preston gagged, his eyes bulging, his hands clawing uselessly at Roman's iron grip. "Please!" Preston choked out, the arrogance entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, naked terror of a coward facing the end. "Please, I have money." Roman leaned in close. "You don't have money, Preston. You don't have a city. You don't have a name. When the police respond to this alarm in 90 seconds, they are going to find a broken safe, 2 dead mercenaries, and the ledger you used to blackmail the commissioner." Roman dropped Preston to the floor like a sack of garbage. Preston landed on his hands and knees, coughing and sobbing in the chemical foam. "I'm leaving you alive," Roman said softly, looking down at the broken man. "Because spending the rest of your life in a supermax prison, looking over your shoulder for the men you betrayed, is infinitely worse than anything I could do to you right now." Roman turned away. He picked up the red ledger from the floor, wiping the foam from its cover, and walked over to Audrey. The klaxons continued to scream. The foam coated their clothes, their hair, but Audrey didn't hear the alarm. She didn't feel the cold. She looked at Roman, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant fire. He didn't grab the back of her neck this time. He reached out and gently, carefully, took her hand. "Are we leaving?" she asked, echoing his words from the night they met. "We are," Roman said. They walked past Preston, who was curled into a fetal position on the floor, weeping into the concrete. They stepped into the elevator, the heavy steel doors sliding shut, sealing the tomb of Preston's empire. As the elevator ascended, rising out of the dark and back into the sprawling, corrupt, magnificent city, Roman pulled her close. He kissed her deeply and fiercely, sealing the bargain they had struck in blood and ashes. Audrey closed her eyes and kissed him back. She had kissed a monster to escape a cage. But as the city lights blurred past the glass, she realized the truth. She hadn't been captured by the monster. She had become his queen. And they were never letting go. Audrey's desperate kiss wasn't just an escape. It was an initiation. She traded a hollow cage for a dark empire, realizing that true power meant standing beside a monster, not running from one. Did you love this intense mafia romance journey of betrayal, revenge, and dark devotion? If Audrey and Roman's explosive story kept you hooked, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our dramatic storytelling.